Whenever I start playing a new game, I hope to end up with enough to say about it. The more I notice, the better my review will end up being. Sometimes I don't have to worry about that at all, but other times, I'll either not have enough to write up a review, or I'll be grasping at straws trying to come up with enough to say. Blazing Chrome is what it is. To throw in another cliche saying, what you see is what you get. In the eyes of some, that may be a bad thing to say, but it's not meant to come off that way. With some games, there's definitely more than meets the eye, but that wasn't the case with BC. Before you even start playing BC, you know that it's a retro-styled game. It's a side-scroller that was released in 2019, but with how it looks and how it plays, you'd think that it's a hidden gem from the 80s or early 90s. With how I've described it, I'm sure that's enough to convince some out there to give this game a try. After playing it and mulling things over for a bit, I feel confident in being able to express what I think of BC, what it generally has to offer, and what stood out to me. From the start, what first stood out to me about BC was how combat and weapons were utilized. When it comes to weapons or items, I'm reminded of something someone once said about a restaurant's menu items. The more you've got to offer, the lesser the quality. I guess I should have just gone with less is more, or quality, not quantity. Either way, BC isn't one of those games that tries to pass off a ton of weapons as a way of making you think that more is better. You get 4 main weapons to choose from, and they were all great in one way or another. The basic machine gun was especially useful because I could easily keep my finger on the button and keep firing. I could see another game forcing me to actually press the button at the rate I'd like to fire, so not having to overexert myself in such a way was nice. I realize how lazy that makes me sound, but button mashing is rough on your hands. It's especially bad for me since I've previously had to deal with carpal tunnel syndrome / tendinitis, and gaming for hours at a time amplifies even the slightest of movements. With a game such as BC, you'd think that the more it has to offer when it comes to visual impressiveness, the better off it'll be, but that's not true. What really bugged me and got me killed a bunch of times was when my own projectiles obscured enemy projectiles. To prevent that from happening, I was forced to alter my rate of fire so that things would be more visible. It was especially bothersome because I was playing directly in front of my computer monitor. If I were playing somewhat far from a large screen TV, I could understand why this happened, but that wasn't the case here. At times this reminded me of 80s and 90s bullet hell games, so you'd think that'd be a good thing, but not for me. One thing that'll frequently pop up in this review is how this game is clearly influenced by all sorts of games and eras of gaming. It's possible that Metal Slug influenced BC in more ways than one, but what most reminded me of that was the use of vehicles. They don't pop up too often, and at times the vehicle heavy levels are closer to what you'd see in Battletoads, but it was still enough to remind me of Metal Slug. It's a small detail to bring up, but it's still worth mentioning because I like it when devs indirectly let you know what they were influenced by. I'm sure some of you may hear that and think that's not good at all, especially since a lot of games handle this poorly, but it really depends on how it's done. I wouldn't go so far as to say that this was handled subtly, but there was enough of an influence that I could see where the idea may have come from, but not to where I was thinking that this was a poor imitation. As I briefly touched upon before, what most stood out to me about the weapons were their rates of fire. Each one definitely has its own strengths, but what kept standing out to me were how useful each of them was, depending on how fast and destructive they could be. Besides the machine gun's usefulness for being versatile, some of my other favorite weapons were the grenade launcher and the whip. It's because they more or less remain active for a brief amount of time once you've started using them. Since combat can sometimes get hectic, I liked knowing that I wouldn't be left vulnerable immediately after having fired. With there being pros and cons when it came to using each weapon, you usually had to get familiar with them to see which one would best suit your playstyle. After some time playing through BC, I started to notice the strengths and weaknesses of most of the weapons. The whip was useful because it stuck around in ways some of the others didn't, but it required more thought when being controlled. The grenades affected wide areas, despite taking a bit of a while to reload, and the laser was great for short bursts and because of its charged up beam. Ultimately, all of the weapons are worth using, and that's a good thing. I'm guilty of sometimes relying on 1 or 2 things in a game, but when it's clear to me that everything that's available to me is worth using, I feel more inclined to give different things a try. The weapons being versatile and having pros and cons when it came to using them definitely helped when it came to wanting to give them all a try, but what helped even more with that was being able to choose which weapon to use even after having received a different one. This also helped with having to avoid potentially bad weapons. I like this because other similar games would more or less force you to hold on to the weapons you like. In games such as those, this usually worked against you because you could easily pick up a weapon you didn't want, and this could lead to you dying or simply having a difficult time until they're able to require your preferred weapon at a later time. When it comes to difficulty in games, I'd say the goal is to try to find a balance between challenging gameplay that still happens to be fun. I'm sure that there are some out there that really enjoy challenging games and they'll sometimes go out of their way to make things harder for themselves, such as by playing through Dark Souls with a Guitar Hero controller, but that's not for me. I have to admit, sometimes games are too challenging for me. It's the stubborn side of me that wants to deal with all of the frustration anyway, in order to beat the game and for bragging rights, but it's still not without its challenges. With how I've been building up to it, you'd think that BC was an ultra difficult game, but it wasn't. BC is a game that has moments where you'll most likely be repeating them multiple times, and where you might end up putting the controller down to come back at a later time. This didn't occur too frequently, but it happened enough times where it's worth mentioning. What's good about this is that the game has ways of showing you how to advance. I don't mean it in a literal sense, but dying a lot and learning from your mistakes is a good way to get through BC. Dying and continuing over and over again is easy, especially during more difficult parts of BC, but the drawback to that is losing out on weapons as you die. If I could sum up how I feel about BC's difficulty, I'd say that it's a balanced game. Some of the levels are a breeze to go through, but there are also others where they're surprisingly difficult, and it's also reasonable for the final sections of the game to suddenly be harder than you would expect. I generally prefer when this is approached like a slow climb on a roller coaster, but I'd say that really depends on a dev's views towards how to handle difficulty in their game. Even if I admit that BC is challenging and not impossible to get through, I have to admit that it took me nearly 2 hours to beat the last mission. What I liked was that even if I was dying over and over again, it was clear to me that beating this game was always within my grasp. That's not always the case with some games, so when I see signs of this, I feel motivated to keep at it until I accomplish my goal. BC was hard to get through, even on normal, so it was nice to see that there's an easy mode to choose from. I didn't see how it changed things up, so I can't say whether or not it's worth giving a try. What I can say is that if you're not the kind of person that's willing to repeat sections of a game over and over again, easy mode is most likely for you. It really depends on what you want out of a game and how much time you have to spare, but I tend to prefer games that are towards the middle when it comes to how long they are. There are some great games out there that are over 100 hours long, but at the same time, there are also some really good ones that are less than 10 hours. It ultimately depends on the overall quality, but a game's length is still something I regularly have in mind. With BC, the saying less is more comes to mind. On one hand, that was a good thing because I sometimes want to get through a game fast, mainly to get to the next one. I'm sure that less isn't more for some, but for BC, that wasn't bad at all. Making it so that you're easy to kill made me think that helps the game not come off as too short. Since you're regularly repeating sections, that ends up elongating the game's overall playtime. I know that some may think of this as a cheap way of making a game longer than it really is, but what's important to note is how this is approached. If a game is simply bad, I'm not going to be happy if it seems that the devs tried to take a shortcut to make it come off as more than it really is. This could turn out differently when you're playing on easy, but since I didn't give it a try, I don't know how easy it really is. I've already mentioned that this is a game that was clearly influenced by specific eras in gaming, and though that's mainly seen with its gameplay, the same could be said with BC's music. Simply put, the music and game in general are just very 80s. The music reminded me of what you'd hear in Hotline Miami or synth/vaporwave projects. By this point in time, that throwback scene may be played out to some, but I like to think that it's revisited for a reason. Great music is great no matter when it's listened to, so I can understand why this style has been used as frequently as it has over the last 10 years or so. That's true, but at the same time, context is king. If this were any other kind of game, I'd say the music is out of place, but since it fits in perfectly with the overall nature of the game, that's nice. One of the best compliments I can give this game's music is that I can see myself listening to the OST outside of the game. Even when some games have great music, that's not always the case. To get into that would be to stray away from the point of this review, so I'll just leave it at that. When it comes to retro-styled games such as Blazing Chrome, I feel as if I approach them with caution. It's because games such as this one are a dime a dozen. I realize it may come off as if I'm insulting BC, but I'm not. The reality is that if you go on Steam and look up modern retro games, you'll be bombarded with endless results that range from great to poor. I'm not enamored with these kinds of games to the point where I'll go through all of them to try to select the great ones from the poor ones, so when someone else does that for me and I like what I see, I'll happily give the game a try. Even if it's clear that BC is a modern retro-styled game, it really didn't feel as if I was playing an old game. It's mainly because it has features that weren't present back during the heyday of this style of game, but it's also due to simply being a good one. Even if I went into playing BC thinking that it'd take me 2 to 3 hours to beat, I got nearly 6 hours of playtime from it. It's clear that I got much more out of it than I initially expected I would, and that was a pleasant surprise. While I do recommend this game, I wouldn't say it's a must-play. If you've been gaming for as long as I have, or maybe even longer, chances are that you've already played a game such as this one. I'd say that this is the kind of game that could be enjoyed at any point in time, but you may be better off getting it when it's on sale. If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching.